Thank you so much, Dan, for agreeing to give a fireside chat for our conference. And so this presentation is a little bit different, a little bit more interactive, I guess, it being a fireside chat. And we're going to be focusing on one case example, but then diving into the weeds a little bit more. But just before we get started, to introduce Dan, he's a packaging technologist and quality manager. Prior, he has close to a decade of experience within the personal care and home sector, working for several multinational companies. In light of the many environmental impact related packaging misconceptions, he's passionate about sharing the science of packaging design and impacts. I feel like you do similar work to me, except for in packaging, which is why I was drawn to you, obviously. So, this fireside chat is going to be focused around recyclability and ecological footprints of packaging with a case example of Morrisons, which I am completely ignorant of. So
Yeah.
could you tell me what's happened?
So yeah, to give you a bit of context, Morrisons is one of our major retailers in the UK. So we've got yeah, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people know Tesco, Asda, Sainsbury's, Morrisons, Waitrose. The UK has quite a wide selection of retailers. Now they're in a position at the moment where they're all jostling to get their green credentials, and some are doing it great, some are doing it in a more pioneering way, trying different things out, and some are doing, kind of what the consumer is telling them is right. And this is, kind of the touch point here, and something that's come up. You see these things come up on things like LinkedIn, where we met, and I'm very firm believer in, if you see something that needs correcting, that needs the science and the reasoning behind it, you should have that conversation, because not everyone has that knowledge and experience. So what Morrison's have done, is they changed their milk bottle packaging. So traditionally, and I don't know whether this is applicable in the kind of the over the sea, over the Atlantic, but in the UK we have HDPE milk bottles, milk jugs, if you will, pint, 2 pints per time. What Morrisons have decided to do is they no longer wanted to supply HDPE milk bottles, and they moved them all into Tetra Pak cartons. So, like you'd normally get orange juice in milk in these cardboard cartons, they've moved their milk into it. And it was a big piece on celebrating this fact. Now, Tetra Pak were very, very clear in saying that they've thought about the sourcing of this. It's entirely green in the way they source it. So they're sourcing it through sugarcane, with FSC paper, and they've built this sustainable story, and they're claiming it's carbon neutral, which it could be, and I don't want to take away from that. I'm sure there's data that I haven't seen that supports that. But the issue is, they've focused very, very much on the creation of this resource, collating these things. And they've made a carton, which is a 5-layer laminated material, which unfortunately, once it's been used, becomes difficult to recycle. So what they've done is they've replaced the HDPE, which is a mono material. So it is just HDPE, which can be recycled curbside, any house in the UK. The council come and collect it, they'll recycle it straight there. With a Tetra Pak, it doesn't quite work like that. In theory, a lot of councils now will support some of the Tetra Pak, but actually it's only Tetra Pak themselves that can recycle this, and to capture all of the milk cartons being used is slightly unrealistic, as they're the only ones with the facility, and it is only one facility in the UK that recycles these. So it was more of a conversation to understand, where we're looking at carbon footprint, people need to start looking at the full LCA, life cycle analysis. So from where you get the material right through to where you end it. Now, I don't want to go into an argument about the kind of the plant-based polymers versus crude oil polymers, because that is, I think we touched last time on it somewhat in the podcast. But it's one of these, once you've laminated them together and they become difficult to recycle, where do you stand on a greenwashing point of view there? It raises these questions. With milk bottles, they have been developed over 20, 25 years into these packs that are perfect for the fridge, easy to move around, lightweight, and recyclable, fully recyclable. And I know there is work happening to put post-consumer recycled content in there, but the problem is the food contact. There's extra regulations you've got to jump through to make sure that it's suitable to add PCR content in. With the paper packs, and this is a trend that I think is a bigger focus and more important, is a lot of people at the moment are developing paper bottles. And this carton is a very good example and a more classic example of what a paper bottle looks like. And as a technologist, I applaud all innovation. I think innovation is important, even if I don't necessarily think that it's the right move. Innovation is important because it means people care, and people care means they're going to try and do the right thing. Even if they go the wrong direction first, they can always come back around the other way. But with paper packaging, it's not a natural water protector. It's not the best thing for the job, so you have to end up lining it with plastic or a very thick varnish, and this is where it ruins that recyclability. And it's making sure that these big companies, before they make these decisions, consult scientists or technologists, people with experience, to support that and not just follow a company's lead, because a company will always sell their product as best they possibly can in the way that maybe misses a few things, not misleading, but just slightly missing data. So it's understanding how that sort of how you navigate that, and how big companies start to action these conversations.
Yeah. And now you just mentioned this, and we talked a whole bunch about it on the podcast. And so we only have a half hour to talk. So for people who want more, then listen to the podcast that Dan was on. It was published earlier, actually, the first episode for this current season. So go on to our website and you can find it there. But you were talking about life cycle assessments, ecological impact, or yeah, carbon footprint, misconceptions. I think a lot of people would be surprised to hear that, and you've alluded to this, but that many of the plastic alternatives have a significantly greater impact when you actually do an LCA. I'll maybe
Mhm.
just put in one extra point because this is something, and this came up in the podcast, but I just want to say it really quickly that with respect to bio-based plastics, sometimes you have to actually look at the LCAs and see what they're accounting for, because if they're not accounting for the land impact of agriculture, that's a pretty gaping hole there. But yeah, would you like to talk a little bit further though on the misconceptions regarding the LCA impacts between, obviously a lot of consumers will focus on end of life, and now there's so many misconceptions, but what about at the beginning of the life?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of focus on end of life in the last couple of years that we've all been in, and a lot of people would have found your podcast by looking through. Recycling is the biggest title that we talk about when we're talking about the end of life. It's the big banner. Beginning of life, it's not really discussed in the same way, and people don't understand. It's a bit like when you talk about food. When there were some terrifying polls I saw a few years ago about where your food comes from, and actually children were asked where a lot of their meat comes from, and they didn't know. The answer was, well, it comes from the supermarket. And it's this misunderstanding of actually where we get these things. And this is where we need to start thinking about being more conscious about our decisions, being more conscious about what the cost of the source of this is. So the classic example, and I think the good place to start is comparing the two biggest one, a modern one and a more traditional one. So we're going to look at plastic and we'll look at wood. So plastic, as we know, comes from refraction process through, making fuel. It is a byproduct of making fuel. We turn it into plastic, or sugarcane, if you will, depending on how we're looking at this, or other methods of getting bioplastics. The wonder of plastic and the reason that we use it in such abundance is it's lightweight. It's incredibly versatile. It is long lasting, and you can use it for just about anything. It can be used in many kind of respects, and it is very, very good at what it does. Of course, it has its limitations as everything, but it has less limitations than a lot of things. When we look at wood, there is many more limitations. So if you had a package that was made of plastic and a package that's made of wood, on average, you'd be looking at least 4 times heavier. Now, the misconception here is people are like, we must get rid of plastic, and there's a lot of targets to get rid of plastic, and they want to replace it mainly with wood fibers, as the main obvious one to go for, because everyone, wood comes from green, it must be green. Unfortunately, it's not quite that straightforward. When you do these things, you've got to count in not just cutting the trees down, because FSC, as we know, they cut down trees, but they plant new trees. That's how the Forest Stewardship Council work. So they ensure that there's a sustainable amount of wood. It's always growing at the same time. So you cut these trees down, you make your wood with it. What you have to do then is you have to treat the wood. So depending on what you want it for, you've got to get it milled down, so squashed, broken into fibers. Then you wet it, put it onto a web to make paper. Then it's a lot of heat and pressure that's put into that. So already we're starting to build up a lot of use. Plastic, it's just heat. We have the refraction process, we have the polymerization, and it's just heat extrusion done. With wood, there's a whole other section. And, paper mills are huge. They're not small things. And they're hugely energy use machines, often next to rivers because they need the water for the process and for cooling. So you have a lot of this water use as well, which is going to be a next big problem after we look at plastic. A lot of people will be concerned about the water use. A topic I won't go into today, but it is something that potentially we could talk about in the future. But when we're looking at the woods, you're squashing this paper together, and it's still just a tree, essentially, and it's being extruded into this. You've got to then cut it and shape it and move it. Now, because it's heavier, once you've made these reels, which are huge, you need to move that reel to wherever you want to do, to convert it into the corrugated card or to the carton board or to the paper. And then you've got to move these things around once they've been turned into these things, and they weigh a lot. Now, the bit that people don't think about is the transport side. With plastic, you have got bottles, you've got a lot of air weight. So there is a lot of weight that's missed. So you've got these trucks moving around with a lot of stuff on it, but it doesn't weigh very much. So the carbon footprint's not great, but it's not bad. But when you look at wood as a whole, it's much heavier, much more dense. So you're actually using a lot more fuel to move it the same distance. So when we're looking at solutions, we need to understand the cradle to grave. So where we get it from, where we put it to, we have to look at that process. And this is why PCR and any post-consumer recycled content, whether it's plastic or you can get PCR papers as well, craft paper. These are important because they do reduce that impact because they're reused over and over again. So it's understanding that weight side of things makes a huge difference.
Yeah, and obviously this is important for glass too. Really big challenge because glass is really
Massive.
heavy.
Mm.
But something that I've heard in other industry conferences is a reasoning for why glass is superior is because, at least from their perception, it's infinitely recyclable. So, what do you think about that statement for why glass is superior from an environmental impact perspective?
So glass is made of sand, essentially, and it is absolutely fully recyclable infinitely. It will never lose any characteristics when you recycle it. So you break it down, you put it back in as color, and then most glass is made with about 30% color, which is reused glass from previous. And glass is fantastic, and it is a brilliant material because you can clean it. It's easy to clean. It doesn't get damaged when you clean it, which plastic can be. And this is why we use a lot of this loop stuff that we see. The reusable packaging doesn't tend to be plastic because, again, it breaks down over this time. So the glass has really got upsides there. The weight is a big downside. Moving around is very carbon intensive. When we compare this with plastic, you have much lower weight. The walls are much thinner, but can behave in the same way with the same structural integrity. But when you recycle it, there's two ways of recycling plastic. We've got the traditional, which is mechanical, which just chops up into bits, and then you heat it and re-extrude it. When you do that, it does degrade the plastic slightly because you're shortening those polymer chains, because everything's made up of these chains to give it its strength. So over a certain amount of time, 40-ish times roughly, your plastic is not as effective as it was the first time. So it does that degrade, which is why people say glass is better. It does take quite a few times, and I think people do tend to mislead a little bit about how quickly it happens. 40 times of chopping up plastic, that takes a lot. And that's not taking into account actually when you're mixing it with other recycled plastic from different areas. So that's only been recycled 3 times, it's been recycled 40 times. Suddenly that becomes a lot stronger because you're mixing it in with the different period of plastic. What you do get is the other method, which is chemical recycling, which actually returns the plastic to an oil, which means the chains are all broken down, you repolymerize it, and you get a brand new plastic. However, there are issues around that with the chemical side of it. Obviously, you're breaking it down. So there's pros and cons to either way, but that makes brand new plastic, which then extends its life more. So I can't say that glass is better any more than I can say plastic is better. No material is better than the other. It depends on the application. We need to be conscious about the decisions we're making based on what we need it for. So if I'm making a product, and we'll take a cosmetic as an example because I work in that field, but if you want something and you know it's very UV sensitive, or you've got to protect it from droppage, glass is actually quite good at that. But the droppage side, plastic is lighter weight and easier to sort of take the impact because of the way it works. It depends again on the customer and what you're doing. There's the luxury thing, and there are other commercial impacts. And this is a lot of things with this recycling stuff that people don't think about, which is there is still costs associated with these. And a lot of the plastic waste conversation is about the value of materials. And this UN conversation about plastic is happening as we speak. I'm sure you've seen it. I'm sure everyone listening will have seen things about it. This is all about having a look at controlling and regulating what the plastic we do. We need to attach a value to these things in order to make them last longer. Glass has a value. For years, if you take a glass bottle and you take it back to the supermarket, they used to pay you to do so. Not so much anymore, but people understand the glass value. If we apply that to plastic, that becomes also a better resource, more reusable. But things are changing very slowly in that. But I mean, I never want to say one material is better than the other. It's just some materials are better at certain jobs. So you do need to understand what you're actually looking at, what you want it to do. And I mean, if you're looking at as well, any formulation, I say formulation in the wide, broad sense, is this could be a mixture of chemicals or it could be a foodstuff. It doesn't matter. Whatever that product is you're protecting, that's what packaging is for, is protect the product and inform the customer and sell the product. This is the fundamentals of packaging. So as long as it does those things, it's a good pack. But if you've got a pack that needs to be protected, that if UV hits it, it could damage that product. You need to put something, either UV inhibitor in the plastic, which is a chemical addition, which doesn't affect it, or with glass, actually you need to dye that glass brown or green, which is why a lot of wines you see, red wine has to be kept in a brown bottle to protect it from the sunlight. That's the whole purpose of having a brown bottle, because it catches that UV, it stops it from breaking through. All these things have a reason, have a purpose. It's just the consumer wouldn't necessarily know why a glass is one color versus another, or the plastic is this thick or this construction. That is why people, in my role, this is what we do, is we assess these situations, choose the most appropriate thing. The confusion here is, of course, there's a lot of misconceptions about materials in the media, which drive the consumers to have purchasing habits based on potentially misinformation.
Yeah, and perhaps another example, which I sent to you on LinkedIn the other day, is around Garnier's fanfare. Now, like, I kind of like some of what's going on, but the way that they're talking about it, about their packaging, of being like a frontier for sustainability and how it was captured in the media piece. Yeah.
The
So,
me,
yeah, what do you
yeah,
think?
it's an interesting one here, because what they're doing is if I remember correctly, it was a non-rinse shampoo. It was a leave-in conditioner or something along these lines. And they put it in a plastic tube with a paper wrap, if you will, which is difficult to recycle. I mean, that's one thing on its own. But more of what they were doing here is a very clever marketing strategy. So It's not greenwashing. It's not either. It's sort of a bit of a questionable one, and I'm not the person to make that call, really. But for me personally, I think the advertisement on the tube is misleading. You can't put it in the curbside. It's not recyclable in that way, because yes, you're using less plastic, but you put paper on it, which means no one's going to go, yeah, I'll recycle that. So I've actually made it less recyclable. The formula, it's the story they're telling about it. And we are all, when we talk about marketing and selling things, every human being is a sucker for a story. You tell a story, some people are going to jump on board with you. It's as simple as that. If you've got that charismatic storyline, people will want to buy from you. This works with products as well. So what they've advertised is this leave-in condition that's been around for years, absolutely years. We've all seen leave-in conditioners for years. But what they're actually saying now is it reduces water usage. Well, it doesn't really reduce water usage in the formulation, because it's still a wet formula. It doesn't reduce water formulation that it ever did before. All they've done is change that story around it, because it's a leave-in conditioner. You don't wash it off. So you put it in, you get out the shower, you turn the shower off, you're saving that water. That's where the water saving is. And it's clever marketing. And this is where there are risks of greenwash or misunderstandings if it's not intended greenwash, which is still greenwash, but you sort of give a little bit of leniency when it's unintentional. But we do need to be careful about the language you use about these things, because it can be seen as misleading that consumer.
And perhaps it's not some like innovative new formula. They've just kind of innovated with marketing. So
Which is
there we go.
innovation in itself. I mean, I've worked for companies where the main focus on innovation is actually you just change an artwork. You change the story you're telling the customer, and suddenly the sales pick up, because you're changing that rhetoric, you're changing what you're telling them, and you're using this language. And this is why, you've got marketeers that are very, very good at their job. You've got salespeople that are equally as good using their story that the marketing team have given them, and they sell it based on that. A lot of it's to do with that. There are new formulas that come out. There are innovations in chemistry. I work with some fantastic people where I work at the moment that are really, really on board with getting that story and understanding. But where the way that they do it is they get the story ready and they present that at the front. And we make a product to that story, which means that we've got the time to do the research. We've got the time to develop a formula that's correct, and we've got the time to really research and understand what the right pioneering technology on the packaging should be. And within that, you will have these guidelines on what our sustainability beliefs are. What we are, a very material conscious business. So it's important to understand that.
Now, for brands listening or consumers who may feel now even more confused about what's happening with packaging and sustainability, do you have any suggestions to move forward for each individual and company and industry, I guess, to do better? What are some of the steps that you would take to opt for more sustainable packaging? Obviously, it's a case by case basis per formula.
100%, yeah. If you're trying to avoid the greenwash, it's difficult. If you don't have the knowledge, it is difficult, and no one's going to take that away. But it's understanding what you're being offered fully. So if someone gives you a solution, ask questions, because the more questions you ask, the more likely you are to get, these answers. Ask for evidence, ask for accreditations, everything, if it's true, it will be written down, and they'll be happy to provide it. And there will normally be some certification, bar some of the pioneering packaging stuff. There's certification sort of coming into play because these are brand new things that I've seen around, but generally there will be some certification to support this claim, or they'll be able to give you a study. Only consider really peer-reviewed studies. LCAs are great, but look where they're measuring from. That's a really important one. If they're measuring from when the material is already processed and in the factory, that's not really an LCA, because that's not going back far enough to really consider what they've done. You need to be going back to, once it's become a plastic, or once, the wood is being turned into paper. Once it goes into the paper mill, that's when you're measuring from for paper. For glass, you're not going to measure desert, absolutely crazy. You're not going to be doing that, but you are going to measure from when it enters the furnace. So it's understanding a bit more about it. Do some reading. There are fantastic books out there, and I don't want to tout any books, but there are some fantastic packaging books that you can get hold of that really, really understand what's going on. There are courses, certainly in the UK, and I know there are in the US, and absolutely acutely aware there are some in Europe as well. There are courses you can do to get the basics of packaging, which I can recommend to absolutely anyone. Really useful to do. Even if you're not a technologist, it's good to do these to understand these things. Or if your business has a technologist on board, sit down with them, have that conversation, press them with questions. I'm a technologist. I don't know the answer to everything, but I'm fortunate in kind of spent time building my network. So if I don't know the answer, I will be able to find it and have these conversations. And even the technical guys within in the wider industry, within the network, we all talk. We have these debates, and not everyone agrees. It'd be a very boring world if we all did agree. But we do these, have these debates to ensure that we're still all moving in the right direction. We all agree, or we know where we need to go to meet in the middle. So talk to people, ask questions. That's what I would say is really, really understand it. Is reach out, ask the question.
And for the consumers watching,
It is a bit more challenging for the consumer because resources are not as easy to come by. It's educating yourself is always going to be the best thing to do. Getting these books and really understanding it, and it depends how devoutly interested you are in this as to how much you're going to look into it. But again, you still need to question things and really ask. And when you're looking at something, just pause for a second before you buy something and think, right, where has this actually come from? And if you're looking at a new brand, and you're thinking about buying something, look at the pack. Think, are there any markings on this that say this is recyclable? Is there any kind of QR code you can scan it or take you? Is this company thinking about what they're doing? Are they happy to provide that evidence up front? And there are more and more brands doing this in a really positive way to show people, go here, have a look. We'll show you videos. We'll tell you how to recycle and how to look after it. There are resources out there. There are certain brands that really, really own this. Find those brands, have a look on shelf. But when you're shopping, just think, how much is this way versus this? Does this look like a good deal? Does this feel like it's the right thing to do? Have a talk with your friends, reach out. The information is out there on different platforms, but the key thing to do is brands are getting better at communicating this, and brands need to continue to get better to ensure the consumer can learn. That's what I'd say at the moment is just look at what you're doing, look at the actual packaging. If there isn't any markings on there, don't be afraid to send an email to the manufacturer and just say, guys, what you're doing. There's no harm in that. I know that the company I work for would definitely take that on board. As the quality manager for the business, I would get hold of that and be like, oh, that's a serious problem. Let's have a conversation about this.
and so before we enter the Q&A period, do you have any final take homes that you'd like to finish the presentation with? Or perhaps there's some points that we didn't get a chance to cover, but you think is important to what we're talking about?
I think the main takeaway from this is, that last piece I said there, asking the questions, asking for clarification and looking for answers. Go out there looking, do some reading, try and find, if you're scientifically minded, it's much easier because you can read these more technical reports, but sometimes the media do some good bits. Keep an eye out on some of the social platforms. There is some stuff. Careful with some and others. LinkedIn is very good. That's where I go for a lot of my stuff, and a lot of networking is done through that. And that is because it is much more of a professional platform where people do tend to know a bit more about what's going on there, as opposed to the alternatives out there, which are a bit more fun. But having said that, I know there's a guy, Corey Connors, that I speak to on LinkedIn, and he's got a podcast, and there are loads of packaging podcasts out there. Obviously, we've had discussion on their list of these things. These experts are out there talking about this stuff, wanting to share our knowledge out to the general public, because I can't change this on my own. It's everyone's responsibility to do what they can to help solve these problems. And we're happy to talk about it. So go out, find those podcasts. I've seen a couple out there recently that I've started listening to because, as I said, I don't know everything. Education really is the answer if we want to solve this problem.